We had two Supreme Court justices come speak to us about this issue, and one of the justices said, well, the process doesn't always look good, right? It's the transparency. Democracy doesn't always look good. Some of the justices might act differently or change the way they act, which would be a shame, he said. It's amazing to hear that, because I actually think transparency makes us look good. The week we had that discussion with the justices in the Appropriations Subcommittee was the anniversary of the release of the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, right? The week it was released, the movie Mr. Smith was screened in front of the U.S. Senate, and they didn't like it. And many of them didn't want the movie released in the United States because they thought it made us look bad. Ironically, what they didn't know is the movie was also viewed in the Kremlin the exact same week. They didn't want it released in the Soviet Union because they thought it made us look too good. So beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, but I think that warts and all, it's still the best government, and it's best viewed when everyone can see it. So that was our first. In my years of experience, what I've learned is that people may not always agree with you, but if they think the process is open and transparent and they respect it, you've accomplished something. So we're all going to have to make those tough choices. With greater transparency, I think we'll make better choices, more informed choices, and the public will know why we are making them, and hopefully end some of the cynicism that goes with what we're seeing today. It is funny at some times, but it's also sad and destructive what is otherwise an extraordinary democratic process in this country. So at this point, so the chairman gets here, Mr. Issa, we're going to hand it over to the panel, Mr. Hollister, and again, thank them and all of you for your work.
Thanks, Mr. Quigley. Hello, everybody. I'm Hudson Hollister. I'm the Executive Director of the Data Transparency Coalition, and so far as I know, we are the only industry organization that is pursuing these policy changes. Representing the public interest and the private sector, we advocate for government to publish its information as machine-readable data, as open data. And so we're grateful for Congressman Quigley's leadership on this issue. We're grateful for Chairman Issa's leadership on this issue. Until recently, there was very little of an industry voice favoring these changes, and we're very grateful for the members of Congress who reached across and have been working on it even in advance of that. We're excited to be here today to talk to all of you, and we're hoping to have a back and forth conversation with everybody about the private sector impact of open data. When government makes the choice to publish its information as machine-readable data instead of as disconnected documents, what happens? Well, I think we're probably preaching to a fairly medium-sized choir here today. The people in this room already favor those policy changes. The policy changes that we're supporting are also supported by the co-chairs of the Transparency Caucus, and I think what I'll do now, Chairman Issa, if you'd like to take the podium before the panel. Thanks.
Imagine me not knowing how to turn on and off a mic.
Just assume you're on.
Exactly. I want to thank you all for being here. Obviously, the Transparency Caucus is something that not only is long overdue, but is beginning to catch momentum. I appreciate everyone being here for the briefing today. Quite frankly, what I find so amazing is why it took so long, and yet, as we saw, for example, San Francisco is now leading the nation in voluntarily putting up, or at least voting on their county supervisor / city council to open up their data in HTML format completely. So it's a start. We could certainly talk about other data that was long ago put up, including the aviation locations and weather. But candidly, I don't think you talk about output data finally being opened up with as much zeal as you do the questions of government, the questions of the unknown. And as I mentioned to Maria Bartra-Negrona this morning, of all people, she was most concerned about the NSA and whether or not we'd ever know what they know, and the answer is it's more than we could take. But quite frankly, I'm thrilled to be here, and I want to thank my co-chair for not only leading off, but he was the one that came to me and said, why don't we form this caucus?
Data economy of tomorrow. I'm a director at FindTheBest. We're a venture capital funded startup founded in 2010 out of Santa Barbara, California. Venture capitalists have given us $17 million to date for the mission of collecting, structuring, and connecting the world's data. So far, over 60 billion pieces of information, and allowing that to lead people to form the best conclusions about different topics. To power this, we've taken what we had about 45 people a year ago and grown that to over 100 today to accomplish that mission. And when you think about how we accomplish that mission, our goal is really to arm, and we currently do over 100 million visits a year, arm these consumers, these individuals with data that has been previously locked away in, say, XLS, CSVs, and heaven forbid, APIs, XML, things that the average individual has just no idea what to do with. I mean, I think most of the people in this room understand these things exist, but how do you actually get the data and get value out of it? So we take this, and we consider this to be this information asymmetry to be a big problem today. There are companies that can work with data, then there are consumers, there's little guy who just doesn't know what to do with it and isn't able to get the benefit of open data today. So we take this data, we get it from
data sources we utilize are a huge mixture. We like to think of ourselves as forming public and private partnerships. We take a huge amount of government data, we get a lot of data ourselves, and we license data from other people as well as leveraging data that our users provide us. And we combine all this data to unlock value that was not previously available to people. This allows us to be very transparent and unbiased and provide people with the facts and tools to make their own conclusions and not try and lead them in any specific way, really empower people to improve their lives, increase their efficiency, and make the best decision for them. Ultimately, these decisions can be huge for whether it's a business or an individual, whether they're thinking about which college to go to, what home they should buy, what car, or which career they should go into. What's the right job for them? Can we give them information to help them choose the career that's growing, where money's flowing, what skills are they going to need, which school can they go to get those skills, and ultimately where should they move to follow that career and make their lives better. So we think about the value that large companies are getting from big data. Big data is a kind of a buzzword that's thrown around a lot, and we like to think of ourselves as kind of big data for the little guy.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Let's go now to Marcus Loui of Socrata to learn more about how Socrata uses government open data to build value.
Absolutely. Thank you for spending time with us today so we can share our thoughts. I work for a company called Socrata. We are a Seattle-based company that was founded in 2007. We focus on helping public sector organizations exclusively, help them take the data that they have and share that and make that data much more accessible to the different types of audiences who need to use it. And so this might include consumers or normal everyday people like you and me. Right? We need to not go through millions of rows of data. We need to quickly understand that data and how it affects our lives. It could be for software developers, it could be for companies who need to access that data via API in a machine-readable way that can keep whatever applications that they're running up to date and to be the most effective to the consumers of those end applications as well. So right now, we are a company that has just under 100 employees. We have over 100 different customers, all public sector. These range from all across government, state and local, cities and states, and as well as federal agencies and NGOs as well. And so you guys want to think about cities like San Francisco, like Chicago, like New York City, federal agencies like HHS, CDC, CMS, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. These are all public sector organizations have used Socrata as a way to make the data that they have more accessible to the people who want to use it. So we, as a company, we act as a kind of complement to the other companies that I think are on this panel in the sense that we partner with public sector organizations to make the data that other people want to use more consumable and easier to use. I speak with you today not only as an employee of Socrata, but also as an open data advocate. I volunteer my time Also at Code for DC, which is a chapter of the Code for America network, which really seeks to use assets like open data to help improve engagement with people in the communities. So thank you for allowing us to spend some time with you.
Thanks very much, Marcus. Now, one of my follow-up questions for Marcus later on will be, if Socrata is a platform and gets paid by the government for open data, how is that actually helping to build the private sector? So we'll get to that. And I think the answer is going to be an interesting one. But for now, I'd like to ask the chairs of the Congressional Transparency Caucus. We have 3 recent startups here on the panel, plus the man who wrote the book about it, all of whom are trying to build businesses using government open data. Do you have any questions for them?
Hudson, you're almost always perfect in how you phrase a question, but it sounds like Socrata, to a certain extent, you exist because these agencies don't have open data. They're paying you to provide them information because their format is not, in fact, fully open. Isn't that right?
I think that's a good way of looking at it. I mean, the notion of transparency has been around for a number of years, and I think if you look back to how agencies have released data a few years ago, it was largely in the form of things like PowerPoints and PDFs, Excel spreadsheets, and CSVs. Right? These resources were available for bulk download for people to access. It becomes challenging from a usability point of view when you make the data available in that way. And Socrata is looking to modernize the way that these agencies release the data so that they can actually reach the broadest possible audience. And so a lot of the technology that companies nowadays are using centers around APIs. It requires that data be structured and machine readable.
I guess just finally, because you're working at the SEC with XBRL, which this is our committee that Mike was on when we founded the caucus, was pretty proud of pushing. What's your comment on the continued resistance to go fully implementing, including you have a book there, but you could have a 10K there in paper, and it would be published the same way, wouldn't it?
And let me just, while you answer that question, if you could all just sort of review the pushbacks you get on the public and private sector, including those problems you have with the chairman's point.
It's a great question, and I think specific to XBRL and the SEC's implementation of XBRL, it's been I think challenging for everybody not to see it really take off and catch fire, and it's obviously created some issues lately, specifically with the Financial Services Committee 4164 legislation, and from our perspective. We see that really being due to, there's really kind of 3 things that we think need to be present for data, open data to succeed. So it has to be easily consumed, and certainly in that case, it's fairly easily consumed. It can be solved. I think that the second point is really where the SEC's XBRL data set is a big issue today, and that's quality. So the quality of the data that we're running into as we process this data, so our process is we take it from the SEC directly, we run it through our machine, and it should turn out into usable data. The problem is that when that data at the SEC level is not correct and it contains errors, it creates a lot of issues with using that data. And so the quality is very important, and investors demand extremely high quality data, 99.99% quality. Whereas the SEC, we're nowhere near that with the data set that exists today. And as a result, investors do not trust the XBRL data. And so we think that really that quality really needs to be addressed before people start using the data. And I think that is really why there is this issue as far as people not using the data. And the flip side is it's created some desire for companies out there. If nobody's using the data, why should we spend all this money to tag it? And until that quality issue is addressed, I don't think those 2 parties really can agree.
Look, You mentioned that I happen to have taken a company public, so my experience is when we gave it to the SEC, it was 99.9999 and some more nines accurate because we spent a fortune making it that way. Just for everyone's edification and kind of for the record, how did we get to be less accurate?
Well, another wonderful question. I think it's there's certainly been an adoption phase. XBRL, the mandate started in 2009, so here we are. We'll be approaching 5 years here, and we still see a fair amount of errors, and a lot of these errors are on the company level. The implementation probably could have made it a little easier to submit quality data, but most of Mr. Chairman, most of the errors we are finding are at the company level. The problem is, though, is that there is no validation that's being done at the SEC, and as a result, that data just flows directly from the company in erroneous format to the investing public, and companies such as ours, who are looking to use that data. So most of it is the actual error at the company level, but the fact that the SEC is not catching it is a big part of the problem.
Are you last question, promise. Are you talking about error, or are you talking about failure to have rigid enough standards as to where things are to be reported in a way that they're meaningful? Because at least what I've looked at is a lot of catch-all dumping of large sums of money that are clearly material into, if you will, areas that mean very little until you drill down. But I appreciate your insight because you are delivering data that has to be analyzed, and if 4% of EBIT is hidden away in a catch-all, is it really of any value at all?
So the errors that we're finding right now, we're primarily focusing on the core financial statements, the balance sheet, income statement, and cash flow statement. And I actually just posted to our blog here within the last week an example of a company that had a share-based compensation expense. Anyway, you probably know it gets added into EBITDA frequently.
I was here when we changed that law.
So a lot of investors will take that number and add it to a profit number to come up with a figure that they use for analyzing companies. Well, this company, instead of presenting $1.2 million of share-based compensation, reported $1.2 billion of share-based compensation, which had a pretty dramatic impact on the results of that analysis.
It'd be small in government.
It's a rounding error.
Yeah, so in this case...
Chad, do you suspect that the company had it right on the paper version and then got it wrong in the data version, that they had to submit simultaneously?
That is correct. In this case, Hudson, they did have it correct in the paper version, but the data version, the XBRL version, was incorrect.
And the SEC didn't reject the data version that had that very large-scale error?
That is correct. The data was not... The error was not caught at the SEC level. It flows out, and it is still out on EDGAR today if you wanted to look at that data.
All right, thanks, Chad, for the discussion of SEC open data. I'd like to know if the co-chairs have other questions for others in our panel.
Well, just for the entire panel. Again, as Chairman Issa talked about, some of this getting on the record is helpful. I'm sure you're all aware. But just generally, how would you describe to the public the pushback you get, resistance you might get in trying to do what you're going to do, the public and private level?
Maybe we'll start with Marcus.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a lot of pushback from some organizations, and usually it starts around, Mr. Quigley, around your comments that they are sometimes afraid of looking bad, and sometimes it could be around issues of data quality because they are aware that the data that they're collecting that they are about to release, they know that they have issues. Usually what happens is organizations, when they make that leap to releasing that data, even if there are quality issues in them, even if that data may make that organization or other organizations look bad, or that's what they fear that they'll look bad, that the transparency that can help to improve the quality of that data over time, right? So it's the belief now is that rather than hide that data, hide the blemishes, that you can expose that and allow people to bring some sunlight to that and make some judgments about how to deal with that.
How about Kevin? What resistance do you see, especially from government agencies, to the notion of releasing their information as machine-readable data?
Sometimes it's not so much resistance as just, say, technical know-how, and that drives a lack of consistency. When we're going to local, state, and federal governments, there's a wide disparity in their ability to actually provide that data, especially at the local level. They don't necessarily have the funding, they don't have the technical know-how, and they don't have a consistent way to get that. We'll get CDs, we'll get paper, we'll get PDFs. I mean, it's just all over the place. So really driving, standards and mandates in terms of how things are being released, whether it's through a public platform like data.gov, which is very good, or leveraging a company like Socrata that can actually has the technical expertise and can kind of scale that across a number of different organizations, could really help open up data. I think the problem is that they haven't been given the funding, they haven't been given the mandate, and if people aren't doing it and they aren't making sure that they're validating the data they're putting out there, they're not being penalized. And this is a big problem that we see when we get data. Just to give an example, USAspending.gov, we use a lot of their data to look at government contracts. There are a ton of errors, but I don't know, they don't really seem to be that concerned with fixing them. And if they had maybe more people on staff to do technical validation, some of them are very easy to catch, like such as a contract that ends in 5008.
One thing Congress is very good at is mandates. Chad, you already described some of the resistance at the Securities and Exchange Commission to the notion of releasing corporate financial data as open data. But you mentioned three prerequisites, three characteristics that government information must have as open data to be successfully used to create jobs. What's the third one? Or just restate all three.
Yeah, I got sidetracked at number 2. So the first is consumable, so it needs to be basically machine readable. The second would be quality, so the data set has that quality. And the third would be complete. And so an incomplete data set, for example, if in the SEC example, if only 20% of companies were filing their financial statements, it would not have much value. In order to have value and be used, we think it really has to be complete in addition to being consumable and high quality.
And why do you think the SEC hasn't intentionally tried to pursue these three prerequisites for its corporate financial information it's collecting?
I guess obviously this is speculation. We are essentially just we view the data. We've been working with it for 3 years, and I think it really is a process issue. And that I think in a lot of the conferences that I've attended where people from the agency have spoken and stated their opinions, they tend to believe that over time these issues will be resolved. That these errors, that maybe a company might have made in their first year, when they make it, they won't be making that error in their 5th year.
Without action.
Without action. And we've seen a lot of examples where we're working with companies where they started filing in 2009. And 5 years later, or not quite 5 years later, their statements still have errors in them. So I think that theory is flawed, and I think at this point, we need to have validation. Otherwise, these errors will not correct themselves.
Thanks very much. And finally, thanks for your patience, Joel. From the researcher's perspective, what factors might help to explain the resistance that we sometimes see to the idea that government information should be published as machine-readable data?
Sure. Well, I think some of them have already been flagged, including the fear that the data sets aren't good enough, the technical difficulty of doing it, the fact that, at least by one estimate I've heard, there are about 10,000 different federal information systems, many of which have incomplete or inaccurate data or legacy systems that are very hard to use. So I think there are a lot of obstacles. But let me just say a few words about what we're hoping to achieve with the Open Data 500 study, because it really addresses all of these questions. So what we're doing is we are looking across all kinds of open data, all kinds of open government data, and all kinds of companies using it. So we're taking a very broad look, but with 500 companies in our sample, that gives us enough to go into some depth in every area. We're asking every company what government data sets they use, and at least what agencies they derive information from. And we're also asking them if they want to give us their feedback on how easy or difficult the data has been to use. Where we want to go with this is our goal, and we've begun talking to some federal agencies about this as well as to several companies. We would like to set up some form of workshops, dialogues, or ultimately perhaps more ongoing collaboration between those in the private sector and those in the public sector for a couple of reasons. One is that we believe that it may be possible to prioritize open data release in a way that would be a win-win. Right now, I think we all believe that open data ultimately, that government data must be open by default, that unless there's a reason to hold it back for privacy or security reasons, it should be available and machine readable. But we also recognize that that's a pretty tall mountain to climb. On the other hand, our estimate so far, and we're still studying this, is that we may have a kind of Pareto principle at work here, where something like 10% of federal data sets hold the great majority of the value to businesses like yours. So if that's the case, and we want to see if it is, we hope to set up a kind of dialogue that can really help identify those as high priority data for release. We're also really picking up very much on what was stated in the open data policy that was issued from OMB and by executive order last May, which among other things said that all agencies should inventory the data sets they have.
Did they?
Working on it is my understanding. I think it's a work in progress, is from what I hear. But that they also should set up points.
You know, I saw the Raiders of the Lost Ark, and they said they had people working on it. And that big warehouses, they put it up there with everything else. There's no question there's a big warehouse there.
Yes, I think there's definitely quite a warehouse. And if you think of Raiders of the Lost Ark, with the added thing that probably you would have to imagine every crate labeled in a different language, most of them no longer in common use, that would probably fit. But I think inventorying, it certainly is possible at the city level. We've seen the city of Chicago do this. I think it's really a very reasonable ask of federal agencies that they ought to be able to at least say what they have. And I think that's really a critical first step that makes everything else possible. The open data policy also talked about establishing points of contact in each agency for public feedback, establishing feedback mechanisms from data users, and having ongoing monitoring and disclosure of the quality of data sets. So our approach in the Open Data 500 study is that these are really the essential elements to beginning a kind of iterative dialogue between data holders and data users, which really has not happened to this point. And our hope is that if we can help facilitate that, we can really accelerate not just towards the ultimate release of all non-sensitive government data as open data, but accelerate the release of the data that's going to make the biggest difference early on.
Joel, if I could ask you whether you think it'd be fair to take two things out of the public use or the use by people who are pro-open data. Can we get rid of the word publish and PDF and imply that either one is data rather than PDFs are in fact published documents, and documents are not data. They have the potential to be data, the same as an amoeba can be a man. It takes a long time and a lot of work to turn one into the other. That has been a frustration to me, is that we go to talk to our government, but quite frankly, the Open Gov Foundation and others talk to all these others, including, thank goodness, Chicago and San Francisco were more open-minded. But a lot of them will talk about, oh yeah, we can publish PDFs, and they think they've in fact given you something. Could you imagine if the census was only available in PDF? You know, how much real good would it do for most of us?
Yeah. Well, the one thing I would say is that I think publishing online in PDF is better than, for example, keeping it on paper in a file cabinet somewhere. But I'm not sure how much better. I think what we're seeing happening in the kind of open data ecosystem is a number of companies or nonprofits or simply data-savvy developers who want to do some good are trying to figure out ways to take PDFs and turn them into true machine-readable open data. But it certainly adds a major step, and one that we're not quite sure at this point, I would say, how accurate or how easy that's going to be. Certainly, I think there's no reason that ultimately government agencies would not be able to publish everything as they should in machine-readable open data. But I do think we're also seeing that some of the resistance may simply be that it is a Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of task. So I think part of the challenge is figuring out how do we get there with the greatest value most quickly along the way.
Well, wasn't comma separated value available before PDF was created?
Fair enough. Thank you. Yes.
We're here because we know that open data has created at least 3 jobs. It's at least created Chad's job and Kevin's job and Marcus's job. All 3 of you guys are here. Your salaries are paid in part because somebody in government, some government, made a policy decision that this information should be published, not as a PDF, but in machine-readable fashion. But what I would like to ask Chad and Kevin and Marcus is, does your work encourage job creation elsewhere outside your company, and if so, how?
It's a great question. I think certainly it's very timely in this economy. So, obviously, as you mentioned, we have our own kind of internal workforce that this is created. But outside of that, I think where our biggest impact is going to be, and that's really in what I'll call connecting capital with the people who need it. So, for example, small companies growing today, small companies that need additional capital to build factories, to hire people. Right now, those companies are not getting the attention of the investing public in general. Most of the large investment funds cannot invest, either by charter or because they are too big to make small investments in these smaller companies. So there is a disconnect in capital there today. And in the investment world, a lot of these decisions are being made by computers. Much like a FICO score determines who will get an auto loan, essentially investment models determine which stocks should be bought and sold. But generally, it's the larger investment firms who have access to the data, because all of those models need data to identify investments. And so particularly smaller investors or even startups who need data to make those types of, generate those business models and those decisions, they need data that today they have to pay dearly for. And so what I think we are going to facilitate is essentially the connection of companies who are worthy of investment, who are growing, who are creating jobs, and connecting those companies indirectly just by publishing their data and making sure that their data is out there in these investment models for smaller investors to find. So I think that's going to be one way that will help. The other is the startups themselves. So we have startups who are using our data. We have growth companies who are venture funded, who are using our data side by side with data feeds that cost $100,000. And those are, I think, those types of startups are creating jobs. So, kind of our ecosystem that we're hoping to build by putting this data out there will be a job creator.
Thanks, Chad. I'd like to ask the same question of Kevin. Outside of FindTheBest, how is, outside of the jobs at your company, how is the government's information published as open data that you republish and offer decision-making on helping to build the private sector?
Sure. Kind of to build on what Chad said, when he's saying that you're lowering the cost of data for companies and this allowing them to build themselves. We also see our ability to relate different data sets as powering people to identify new expansion opportunities, whether it's in a new industry, a new region, or a new market. And these funds can be coming from venture capital, they can be coming from other businesses, and they can be coming from government. So one way to drive this is expansion. Another way is that we help consumers identify companies that have products and services that are available to them. We drive them, potential business, new customers. This allows them to expand, build bigger sales force, build more, sell more products, expand their manufacturing, and really kind of reach these consumers that they might not have otherwise found. An example of this would be financial advisors. We take a large amount of financial advisor information from the SEC and individual states. We bring this together with disclosures, which company they work for, how that company's performance is for each region, and we allow consumers to go on there and maybe they wouldn't have gotten a financial advisor, but because we allow them to kind of break through that information asymmetry, we allow them to find a financial advisor that can help them make more prudent investment decisions, and therefore we need more financial advisors out there. We spur job creation that way.
And how about Marcus and Socrata? Sure. So I think one of the beautiful things about having data be open by default is that you can't always predict how that data are going to be used. And we've seen in countless examples of our customers that they will release data and there will be companies who spring up and they integrate, they bring in that data as a core function of the value that they offer. Oftentimes they take that data and they integrate it with other sources of data. Sometimes it's proprietary, sometimes they manipulate that data to bring additional value. But still that data is being made accessible to them as a core part of how they are operating. I think as a company, Socrata also has a great opportunity to help support standards across different public sector organizations, and so we've touched on the value that standards have. And I think anyone in this room who's tried to work on a standard, tried to get this to pass, realizes how difficult that can be. We kind of sit at this place where we have an opportunity to work with various public sector organizations to kind of work on standards in a bottoms-up approach. And this has this benefit of creating additional jobs, because if you think about it from the point of view of someone who's consuming that data, right? So for example, if you are a company in New York City who's consuming regulation data, permit data, and you're providing some value to building owners about changes in regulation, new buildings that are going up, you're using that data from New York City in a format that is kind of unique to that city. But if you're going to Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, as a company, you only have to kind of learn how to do that integration once. And so the innovation and the value that you can get out of using that data becomes a lot faster. And so companies can grow, and the work that has to go into that innovation becomes a lot less. And so as a company, we're trying to make efforts to make use of this network position that we sit in to really help public sector organizations share their data in a way that's going to be more consumable, and then help those consumers of that data use it a lot more effectively.
Sure thing. One more thing from Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on your first point, I think the value of the serendipitous nature of people using data in ways you didn't expect cannot be overstated. We've found numerous ways where we'll put data up there and give people the tools to draw their own insights from it, and they'll do things we never expected with it. It really comes from learning, listening to our customers, the people who are on our site, and the users of the data, to find out there are very many unexpected ways people can get value from data once it's out there and once it's understandable. So I think that point cannot be overstated.
Now at 2 p.m. sharp, 10 minutes from now, with the indulgence of our host, I'm going to ask the final question, which is, what should Congress do to help this sector grow? But for now, I'd like to throw open the floor for audience questions. In the interest of time, I'll try to direct each question to one panelist. Questions from the audience, I'll repeat them. Yes?
I find open data very interesting because, like you said, you can do a lot with it. You can have different groups of people analyze that data. Will you be doing anything to help people learn how to analyze the data, and because you have to do statistical tests on it to see if there are differences or if it's in order to support a claim?
What's being done to help people who might not have special expertise analyze open data? That sounds like a question for Kevin.
Yes, I will try and do what I can there. So we kind of see there's two different areas. There's statistical kind of analysis on aggregate data, which is difficult, and we're working to improve our tools in that area. And there's also what insights can we derive from visualizations, charts, and other pieces of information to really allow consumers to understand all they can about an entity or a different topic. Something we're doing in that space is partnering with publishers to allow our data to be openly used in chart format, so that people who write articles about topics can take this data and then write more information about what the data means to really drive understanding about a topic. We understand that with 60 billion pieces of information on our site, it's going to be impossible for us to teach everyone what every piece of information means. But if we can enable other people who are writing about different topics, whether it's sports, government spending, business, education, to take our data, take charts, take visualizations which may be confusing to maybe the layman and explain what they mean in context, we can really drive understanding in the space.
Thanks very much, Mr. Quigley. We appreciate the sponsorship and the hosting of the Congressional Transparency Caucus. Thank you. We'll call now for additional questions from the audience. I think I saw one from Alex.
Yep. When the congressional disbursements for expenses went online, were digitized, as you heard in a forum during Sunshine Week, not all the data went online. It became more generalized instead of being specifically itemized towards who made which expense for which thing. How is the Data Act or any other bills that Congress is putting forward going to prevent obfuscation when things become more transparent digitally? What's to prevent the increased transparency that people expect through data use from resulting in the data sources themselves becoming dumbed down?
Well, that's a great question. I'll take a quick stab at it. Moderator's prerogative. As Alex Howard points out, when government agencies make the choice to publish their information online in a machine-readable or non-machine-readable even format, that sometimes gives them an opportunity to look at the information again and find ways of dumbing it down, find ways of making it less detailed. I think the only way in the long run to prevent that is public accountability for organizations that take the industry perspective, for organizations that take the public interest perspective, to put pressure on government not to do that dumbing down when that transition happens. And I think I'd like to see if any of our other panelists have thoughts on that. Do any of you, in your experience, has that ever happened with data sets you work on? Have you ever seen the government make a choice to move to publishing its information in a machine-readable format and yet take that opportunity to dumb it down or to remove needed details?
I'll just take a crack at that. I think this falls in line with with comments before about issues of quality of the data, or I think as Alex was mentioning, a need to or desire to make that data accessible to those people who are using it. So they kind of pre-think that through. They format the data and transform it in a way that they think is going to be more easily accessible, when in reality the fuller data set is going to provide the most value. I think we need to think about the release of data as also a conversation. It's something that's longer term. And I think that even if you release the data in a way that may not allow it to fully express itself, that the fact that you did, you are generating demand for that data, and you are generating demand for the full release, the complete work of that data. So I'm not going to mention any specific examples, but we have seen people kind of iteratively release more and more data over time.
Now, Mark, is that in response to massive public ridicule, or was the conversation more civil than that?
It's more civil than that, because part of it is there are subject matter experts who understand what the true potential of that data are, and when they see the data that's released, they do push to make the complete version of that available. And so usually it's driven because someone knows that there's more out there, and it's very virtuous in nature.
Very virtuous. Let's see if there are other questions from our audience or any of our panelists. Yes, in the back.
Hi, Hudson. Thank you so much. This is a fantastic forum. I guess, having recently come from one of the agencies, I'm wondering, what is this group or this organization doing to help some of the concerns you mentioned earlier about the resistance on the agency, so they don't get their hands slapped for actually trying to be cutting edge, leading edge, particularly if you're working with CFPB and others? How have you been able to break through that bottleneck of their risky exposure to kind of jumping into this form in a real way?
Well, anybody on the panel, can you name any success stories for breaking through that resistance in your evangelism for open data?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting ones was what USAID did, I guess this is now maybe a year or two ago. they realized that they had a lot of problems tracking the geolocation of the people they had been funding. And rather than hugging the data and hoping nobody would find out, they decided to clean it up through a very interesting kind of crowdsourcing. They recruited a group of, I think it was around 100 sort of geospatial hackers from around the Washington area, people who just love working with that kind of data. They brought them in, they gave them access to these files, and they said, we'd like to give you all a weekend to see what you could do, and within 16 hours they had cleaned up the data. And I think there is actually tremendous untapped potential for developers and coders and hackers with civic interest to help in what is going to be a very major task of data cleanup. So I would love to see more agencies follow that model, acknowledge the gaps and the errors in the data. I don't think this has to be a lot of finger pointing. It's kind of endemic to government data sets, and come up with some creative ways to engage the tech community in helping solve it and get credit for doing that.
One more question from the audience. Crickets from the audience. Well, yes.
With respect to the price that public has to pay to get those packaged aggregated data from one of your services, I mean, what previously has been free and expected to be free by the public is now somehow being charged to be accessible. So, I mean, I'm not asking this question with criticism, but what's your view in terms of the price the public has to pay to get this data?
Okay, that's a great question. Some of you on this panel are selling subscriptions to the information that you published. What do you have to say for yourself?
I'll take the dive first here. So this is still kind of the same model, right? And this has been in existence for a long time. Where
this is free.
This is not free. This is actually, a lot of companies have to pay a lot of money to get access to this data set. As I mentioned, up to $100,000 today. So what the open data does for us is it allows us to deliver that. Obviously, we are still a business. We have to charge for that, but we can deliver that same quality, in fact, probably higher quality, at a fraction of the price. So we're not actually generating revenue off our data set yet. We just went into our beta testing in November. But our plans are to offer this data set for a fraction of the price of what it would cost from an existing provider that doesn't use open data.
We're running out of time, but I'm sure our panelists will be around to answer further questions if any of you would like to come and meet them. I'm going to move to my final question now, and the final question is, bam, bam, real fast, what should Congress do? And I'll tell you all that I'm going to be listening to this as well, because this is my job. This is the Data Transparency Coalition's job. We decide what to lobby for. We decide what policy changes to request based on what the private sector needs to build businesses. So, what should Congress do? Let's start with Joel.
Congress should pass the Data Act and the Transparency in Government Act. But in addition, Congress should keep a very close eye on the implementation of the open data policy from last May. This is a policy that, if implemented, I think will really be transformational. But implementation is not a sure thing. And I think it's too early to tell, but there's a possibility that some legislative push would be ultimately useful, and it also will, of course, have funding implications, because this is not going to be cheap or easy to do this right. So I think that it's an area that Congress should watch closely and do whatever is necessary to ensure that there's the resources and the drive to implement what is, I think, really a kind of world-leading policy if it's done right.
Chad Sandstedt from TagniFi, what should Congress do to make it possible for you to keep building your business?
So I have 4 items that I think are really important. If I could suggest steps, certainly one would be going back to the completeness factor, and that would be to certainly go away from HR 4164, which would basically exempt a large pool, probably 70% of companies from filing tagged financial statement data, which would be very detrimental to our company, but also to investors in general. I think another big decision that needs to be made is specific to the SEC data set, which is really what we're working on exclusively, is to validate or to enforce data quality standards. If the data is not of high quality, even if it's complete, nobody is going to use it, or the cost to use it is going to be so high that people will just keep buying these. I think there are some opportunities as well to expand the use of open data or tagged data, particularly in the financial statement arena or the financial arena, to include earnings releases. So, for example, when a company comes out on a quarterly basis and says, okay, here's how much we earned, it hits the wire, and that is a very important event. It right now is essentially just a text file that goes over the wire and is filed in text format through an 8K form. If those were tagged, it would be huge for the investment world to be able to analyze that immediately. So both the earnings releases and the proxy statements. So proxy statements include essentially voting material, shareholder or management compensation, ownership type of information. Tagging that would be very valuable to the investing public. And then the last thing that I have is, I would look at it potentially replacing existing filings. So, for example, a 10Q, which is a quarterly filing with the SEC today, it's primarily just really its data in there today, but it's published and has been published in really a paper format or a derivative of paper format. And really what people want is the raw data. So I would recommend to possibly evaluate getting rid of the 10Q and requiring companies, particularly some of these smaller companies that may have a burden with filing with the SEC, to just file a data file and not have to worry about putting together a quarterly report, because all of the good stuff is in the 10K with the annual report anyway. So those would be my suggestions.
Kevin Davis of FindTheBest. What should Congress do to get you more open data to deliver to consumers and make money off the advertising?
Yeah, well, agreeing with Joel and Chad, I think a major point that we can push to really lead in the information economy as a country are standards and consistency across data at all levels of government and even into the private sector. If everyone is using, and there are standards that already exist, XML, different APIs, we can push these standards both in terms of how we can request data and then how we ultimately receive data. Makes things a lot easier for us. Our data scientists and data engineers can be that much more effective, and we can really get the data out there to people to use it that much more quickly and allow them to really unlock value.
Marcus Loui of Socrata, which aspires to be the rallying point for government information. If you could get Congress to do anything, what would it be?
I won't prescribe any specific policy, but I will give a few observations that we've learned over the years. I think that the first is that it's important to democratize access to that data to as broad an audience as possible, because this way you are increasing the pool of stakeholders who are looking at that data, using that data, and ultimately improving how that data are released. The second thing that we've learned is that when you are able to gather communities of people around that data, make that data accessible to them, you can really drive innovation. I think some of the comments we've been making around standards plays right into that very well. We see a lot of innovation happening around cities, partly because of the geographic proximity that stakeholders in that data have to each other. So there's a lot of communication, a lot of collaboration that goes on with the use of that data. I think that something that we've kind of barely touched on, but I think something that is important, is also the timeliness of the release of the data. I think anyone would say that stale data is not going to be useful. You might as well not have released it. Now, I say that, I qualify that depending on the use of that data, right? So if you are, if it's important to have up-to-date information, like say like with products or weather is a perfect example, then you want to make sure that the release of that data is timely.
Well, the fact that we're here with the snowy Capitol visible in the window, and the fact that we see some of these changes proposed and even about to pass in Congress means that Congress is listening. Our coalition will do its best to take advantage of that. Please join me in thanking our panelists.